Feels like deja vu up here. All right, thanks for sticking around. So the title of my talk is Ticks and Fire Management, Reduce Ticks in the Northeast. And if you see, there's ticks crawling around Northeast in the picture there. So as I said before, that's where I got bitten by ticks and got diseases. And like a good fire ecologist, I said, let's not burn that little hole in the donut there, because I want to study it. And that was a bad idea, I guess. Should have listened to the fire manager and burn it all, when you have the opportunity, right? So, like I said before, I'm not an expert on ticks. I'm a fire ecologist and a fire behavior scientist. But I started realizing that there's perhaps some connections with fire and ticks that are overlooked. In the Northeast, the cases of ticks, as you may have already known, are increasing quite a bit, and there's new diseases that are emerging. This is a map of tick-borne diseases in the United States, and as you can easily see, there's quite a lot going on in the Northeast. And other things besides people get ticks too. Your wildlife, your livestock, and your fur babies are getting tick diseases, and it's an increasing issue. So presently there's approximately 14 tick-borne diseases in the Northeast. There's more across the country that are vectored by about, in the Northeast they're vectored by about 5 or 6 different species of ticks. And all of these are debilitating, some worse than others. They're all increasing. And what's interesting about ticks is that, as you learned in the last presentation, they've got some different life cycles. And so their life cycles can last years, and at different points they have different potential for carrying these diseases. Also, the ranges of ticks seem to be expanding quite a bit. So black-legged tick or deer tick vectors Lyme disease, that's the one we all know about. And as you can see, in the past, the map on the left shows 1907 to 1996 reports of tick observations. And then with another 20 years after that, you can see the Northeast and the upper Midwest and Florida are blossoming with black-legged tick reports. Also in Canada, we're predicting increased range of black-legged ticks within the next, by the end of the century. Lone Star tick is another one that most of you probably know about and already know it's expanding in the Northeast here. This is the current range in black, and there's a recent study done. The red shows where they expect it will increase its range within this century. So getting back to fire. So it seems to me that a lot of the folks who do tick research aren't landscape ecologists or fire ecologists, but a lot's changed in the Northeast and the whole country over the past 80 years of fire suppression or so. This map is from Rich Guyette and Mike Stambaugh and Dan Day, and this was an estimation of what the historic fire regime might have been like from 1650 to 1850. A lot of the Northeast and the rest of the country really burned quite a bit more than it does presently. And if you look at Florida, the darkest orange is about an annual or 2-year burn, and then getting up into the yellow is about a 10-year fire return interval. And this decline is everywhere, as we all know. Here's a figure from a paper from 1981 showing decline in Maine and New Hampshire. Got to throw New Jersey in there because that's where I'm from. And so, again, looking at this increase in tick-borne diseases and ranges, we can overlay, these lines represent where Amblyomma americana is, or the Lone Star tick. So if you look on the inside of that black line, there's a lot of area that burned pretty frequently prior to present day. The gray line on top is where Amblyomma is predicted to expand to by the end of the century. So there's not a ton of research that really gives a good landscape scale approach of what things might have been like. But if you go back to 1754, this guy is Peter Kalm. He's the first person to describe Kalmia, and he was also the first person to describe ticks in the United States. He was working in that place called New Sweden that we've all visited before, and he was interviewing some of the local old-timers of 1754 who were complaining that when the government forbade burning of the forest, they started having tick problems, and they were upset about it. This graph is a little bit hard to see on the screen, but this was some recent research by Elizabeth Gleam, who's now at Hollis University, and she did work down in Georgia, and it showed a pretty marked decline in ticks with prescribed burning, not only in the same unit, but in the adjacent units to the prescribed burns as well. And this effect lasted for, I believe she conducted her study for 4 years. And so there's a maintained effect for at least a few years there. So I started asking a bunch of questions about this. We do a lot of studies in the pine barrens across many different fires and thinking about how can we leverage our opportunities to learn something about this. And what I really wanted to know was how does dormant season fire, since that's the dominant fire here at least, how does dormant season fire impact tick populations, their habitat, and the disease prevalence? So, as you all know, we've had a lot of fire for a long time in the pine barrens, and we continue to have a very active prescribed fire program. We also have a number of different tick species there. We've got the black-legged tick, the lone star tick, the dog tick, they all vector diseases. And then we have this new Asian longhorn tick. And that has been spreading rapidly. If you don't know, it can reproduce asexually, the females can. They reproduce about 2,000 at a clip of themselves. And what's interesting about them is that they don't carry any diseases here. In Asia they do, but they also exsanguinate large animals. So that means that they suck them out of blood. So in my work, I spend a lot of time looking at differences in fire behavior and how that precipitates different fire effects. And you all know from burning that not every fire is the same, and there's a lot of variability within fire. And a lot of the historic research on ticks and fire has failed to really dive into that. There have been a number of the studies just say, you know, it burned or it didn't burn, and we did or didn't see a difference. But this map on the right is basically showing a broad range of effects after a landscape scale fire project. So we set up a study in the pine barrens using 27 plots, or 27 different units. 14 of them had burned and 13 of them didn't. And they're spread across a 15 by 20 mile area. So trying to get a pretty good idea, at least in the central core of the pine barrens, what ticks might be doing there. We looked at a range of burn severity across our plots. And if you're not familiar with burn severity, a high severity plot might look like this. A medium severity plot, this is kind of an upper medium severity plot, might look something like that. And a low severity plot will still have green needles. You'll still have a lot of vegetation left in the forest floor. So our plots represented a range of severity pretty evenly across our 14 plots. And we measured vegetation characteristics in those plots. So we measured the canopy structure, we measured the shrub structure, we measured the litter, the duff. So that's all the tick's environment. That's also the area that it's going to interact with wildlife in. So the more surface area, our idea was the more surface area it had to interact with deer and other wildlife, the more chances that diseases would get transferred. The other part was to look at how the microclimate changed with these different degrees of severity. So we put out these little sensors. They're really kind of neat. They just plug in with a USB into your computer, and they log for months. And so that's just a little homemade solar shield that we put on. We hung them at 10 centimeters. That was about as close to the ground as we could get without it getting too much backsplash from rain into the sensor. And then we did surveys. And so we surveyed for ticks doing this drag and sweep method. So basically, I took all the mop handles at the station and put white cloths on them. They're about a meter, well, they are a meter in size. And if you're gonna sweep, it's like sweeping the floor. You just work it down on a plane kind of like this down into the shrubs. And then if you're gonna drag it, you kind of drag it like a flag across the top of the shrubs. It's really simple, it's really easy to do. I never thought that I would do that in my career. I really never thought I'd be one to come up with the idea for doing that. Well, it's actually kind of interesting. So then we got the ticks off with a lint roller, and it's really rewarding to see them all stuck on there forever. And so we brought them back to the lab and analyzed them, we'll took them off the lint roller. And there's a graduate student and an undergraduate and a technician who've done an incredible job counting these ticks and characterizing them. And we've taken, since none of us are actually tick experts, the graduate student is, we've taken a picture of every single tick in our study. So we've got about 3,500 tick pictures now, in case anybody has an issue with what we've done. We sampled in June, August, and October to try to match the seasonality of ticks. So the different life stages have different peak times in the year of when they emerge. So we were trying, it takes a lot of time to catch these things and to count them. So with a limited amount of time, we picked 3 months, or 3 windows of the year, and we sampled across 3 days in June, August, and October. And so now we're going to get into some results here. This slide's not showing up great on the projector, but basically what it's showing is 3 different components of vegetation structure. On the left, you've got average shrub height, in the middle, we've got litter depth, and on the right, we've got duff depth. And what the figure is showing is your x-axis is increasing burn severity. So as severity increases, your structure diminishes. Makes sense, right? The hotter the fire was, the less is there left over. So there's less structure in the tick's environment afterwards. This figure is showing a similar trend. So this is temperature that we measured with those little sensors. Again, on the x-axis, we have our burn severity. So it's increasing, going left to right. And as severity increases, so does the temperature at 10 centimeters above the ground. And actually, that temperature change is quite profound. Can't see it real well on the screen, but the peak temperature changed by about 15 degrees centigrade between the unburned and burned areas. So it got quite a bit warmer. It's not on this figure, but the highest severity plots also got coldest first. So we had frosts in September, early September, in our highest severity plots, which for New Jersey is early. Another interesting thing was that relative humidity decreased quite a bit in those high severity plots. So again, on the left we have unburned, and on the right we have high severity, and that's making the tick's environment less hospitable. If you're a tick, your biggest problem in the world, besides getting a meal, is desiccation or drying out. And so the hotter and drier it is, the harder it is for you to survive. And then this figure is kind of the one that I think tells it really well. Again, we have burn severity on our x-axis, and each of those 3 groups represents each month of data. So the 4 blocks on the left represent June, the middle represents August, and the right represents October. We caught the fewest ticks in June and the most in October. And for June and August, you see a trend where we have fewer and fewer ticks pretty much as burn severity increases. October got kind of interesting. The high severity still had the lowest amount of ticks by quite a lot. But then our green and blue represents medium, or low and medium severity, had quite a few ticks. And that difference was a lot of larval Lone Star ticks that we found in those plots. But what was interesting is that it wasn't consistent. So some plots had none, and then other times you would hit just a huge nest of them. Somebody mentioned 100 or 200 ticks. In a couple of our drags, we caught about 300 Lone Star larvae. And our drags were about as long as this table. That was the distance that we walked. So what was interesting is in the unburned area, there were much fewer ticks, but they were very consistent. We always got about 20 per transect. And so there's a spatial thing that's happening here, I believe, with the distribution of ticks. The take home from this figure is that orange, each color represents a different species of ticks. In June, August, and October, approximately 95% of the ticks that we found were Lone Star ticks. We found almost no black-legged ticks, and interestingly, we found some winter ticks in October, and we found a handful of dog ticks in June. The other thing we looked at was a comparison of methods, and so a number of these papers that we've been reading all use, in addition to not characterizing fire very well, they're not characterizing their methods very well, they're not consistent methods. And what we found is that there's actually a pretty marked difference in the amount of ticks that you catch depending on the method that you used. So we did both the drag and sweep method. Drag is represented by blue, and sweep is represented by orange, and basically those are the proportions of ticks that we caught using each of those methods in each month. And I think part of that is how different life stages are more apt to be caught than others. So if you just used the drag method, you would be skewing your data one way for June and the other way for October. And so I think it's actually a good idea if anybody was going to repeat this to use both methods. I think that we thought one would stick out as the better one, but I think what this is showing us is that at one point one's better and at another point the other's better. So we're going to keep doing this study for the next year at least. We'd like to track these plots while they recover. But I think we found some pretty interesting outcomes already. One was that, at least in the short term, fire did have a pretty profound impact on the tick populations that we observed. And it'll be interesting to see whether those rate increases that we saw in October will actually make it through the winter or not. You got to remember there's reduced leaf litter there, there's reduced duff there because it burned. Another outcome is that long-term impacts seem to be species-specific and linked to burn severity. And that's kind of, I think, why we got that difference in October there. Also, fire reduces the vegetation in tick habitat and increases the extremeness of the conditions there, and quite a bit. It was measurable, and that might have impacts on other things. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about earthworms and earthworms living in leaf litter. There's a lot of things that live in that environment other than ticks, but if you kind of think about how historically there might have been a lot more fire in this landscape, that pressure that it would have had on things that live in that level would be different than it is today. And then we also kind of learned something about the efficacy of drag and sweep techniques for catching these in our environment. So I think that research like this is useful as ticks continue to expand in their ranges and other insect vectors become more important. There's a little bit of research from Africa that suggests that fire might be beneficial for helping reduce mosquito populations. Again, I imagine it's by making it a hotter and drier microclimate. So one of the pieces we left out was how wildlife might play into this, this equation here. I'm sure you've all noticed some big changes in wildlife populations over the years. I know in my lifetime, I never saw turkeys growing up. Now, if I don't see 24 turkeys every day, it's a lot, or I'm surprised. Raccoons, there's a huge distemperament. A lot of things like raccoons declined quite a bit about 20 years ago and had a major recovery. And then deer and squirrels and chipmunks are all important as well. Down south, there's a little bit of research about how deer use burned areas differently than unburned areas. And basically, they use burned areas increasingly with time since fire. Turkeys also seem to use burned areas a little bit differently than unburned areas. This just shows a pattern of usage within about 250 days after a fire changing. And then also turkeys and their parasite burden changes quite a bit in burned and unburned areas. So we're not looking at that in our study right now. We are going to look at the diseases that our ticks were carrying, and we're going to use QPCR. I don't do that, so there's a picture of how it works right there. We've got some other folks involved who do that, but we've kept all of our samples, and there was another study where they actually looked at the genetics of the blood meals of all the ticks that were captured to get an idea of how wildlife were behaving in these different plots. And if we had some money, maybe we could do that in the future. We'll have these tick samples. So that's what we got. And then I've just got to thank our team here. Lexi Everlin, she's our technician at the Silas Little Experimental Forest. She's been incredible in keeping this data organized and keeping our little field team motivated. She's been an excellent asset on the team. Nathaniel Schmidt is a master's student, and I made a mistake at the beginning here, but Jesse Cry, sitting in the front row here, we've been working on this project, co-leading it together. Nathan is Jesse's master's student. He knows a lot about ticks and has been really fun to work with. And then Julia DeFeo is an undergraduate working with us, and the three of them have done a phenomenal job at keeping this together and not going insane looking at ticks endlessly under the microscope. And then Andrew Easy from Rutgers, Jeremy Weber from New Jersey Forest Fire Service has been a big support, Nick Skoronsky and Matt Patterson. And then I should also just add, this is kind of an example of co-production in science. We got a lot of input from local farmers and some fire wardens about what their thoughts were and where the opportunities might be. Our plots range a pretty good span of private and public land. We've been using cranberry farms for our annual burn condition, so there's also some different timings or time since fire in our project. And then this was just the group of folks who supported this work. Anybody have any questions? That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't think the way we've collected our data, we could tell that. There have been some other studies where they say they've caged ticks, or they've caged eggs, and I think that they put them in some kind of real fine, like, envelope or something that they can't really get out of, and then they'll dig them back up and look at them. And that would be an approach for doing that. So they're actually raising the ticks in the lab, so they know how many they start with, or what life cycles they started with, and what species, and then continue looking at that. So we can't answer that, but it is a question that could be asked. Yeah?
So I was kind of curious about the June, August, and October things. Is it because of the way they're out, they go back in the ground during the flying season?
Yeah, so like I said before, ticks the biggest problem you have as a tick after getting fed is drying out, and so ticks do go back into the soil and leaf litter pretty frequently, from what I can tell in the literature, a lot more than I realized before I started reading about it. And so we were sampling at the most active time of day. So we were trying to sample between 9 and noon. Sometimes it went a little bit later than that, but when it wasn't too hot or dry, to be honest, sometimes we got stuck out there a little bit later, walking back from plots, and I don't think it made a difference what time it was there. It was just crawling with them. Either it was crawling or it wasn't in the plot. But we did sample over, I think a pretty comprehensive range of conditions at those points. But that could be a concern. I don't think it impacted the study.
No, I was just kind of curious, because I know we can get them as late as November, just before snow is still.
Yeah, and somebody was mentioning it, that they knew a bunch of people who got them in February up here. They're different diseases, especially closer to the ocean. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of thought about, like, ticks are only out at this time, or they're not out this time. But I think there's an awful lot of wiggle room with with where they actually spend their time or how often. And I think that the forest conditions and how open it is, how much sunlight's getting through, you know, where they can seek refugia under maybe just some leaves on a plant, it's probably pretty important to how much they're really going to go back in the soil, you know. I mean, it's a great question. I think that a lot of the research on ticks has been laboratory oriented. There's a much less field research. A lot of it's with like manipulative experiments in the laboratory. So I think that there's probably a lot more variety out there in nature in reality.
Like, seasonality of that?
Yeah.
So June is actually peak tick season for nymphs of black-legged ticks. August for the larvae, and then the adults start coming out in October, and they'll be out until the following May. So that might be the reasoning of the timing for that, because those are all peak activities.
Yeah.
Black-legged ticks, different life stages. So especially for scooping and dragging when you're collecting.
Yeah.
Those are the techniques for collecting, especially the juveniles.
Yeah.
The dragging is more for adults.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I was really surprised that we caught almost none, which was surprising to me. But it also might be a difference in forest type too.
Yeah.
You know, like, yeah, it's pure pitch pine in a lot in all of our sites actually. And so, you know, a more northern hardwood forest or an oak forest might have some different things going on. Definitely some different wildlife uses.
We found huge differences between pine barrens versus hardwood forest.
Yeah, I'd like to chat with you a little bit about that.
Okay. And we all are a little more hardened, so they're more likely to be in pine barrens where it's a little drier, so the sand is more sandy. Versus your ticks that are kind of woody. They dry out really easily, so they need a good layer of leaf litter in order for them to survive. And they do constantly all day. They're going up and down through the leaf litter so they can rehydrate and then go find a hook. And rehydrate and go find a hook.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's some. You're more of a tick expert than I am for sure.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah.
did you say how big were your burn research plots and?
Yeah, so I think I glossed over that part. So the plots were 7.3 meters in radius, and we walked a transect from plot center out to the edge, doing either a sweep or a drag, and then we came back doing it the opposite or the other technique. And we did that 3 times in each plot when we sampled, and every day when we came back, we rotated our transects so we weren't walking over the same area each time. So we rotate them 3 times in a month, and then we go away for a couple months.
And your actual prescribed fire area, the project area, how large was that in relation to?
Sure, yeah, each burn unit, I would say, a couple of the annual burn units were pretty small. I guess there was one that was probably 2 acres, but otherwise, aside from that, I would say everything else was 10 or more acres, for sure. And everything was you know, off the edge, about 50 feet or more, to try to minimize an edge effect.
Is there much information on immigration and how ticks move within pine barren systems? I don't really know.
Like after a fire?
Like in habitat in general. How
yeah.
site tenacious
Well,
are they?
They're moving around on deer and rodents and stuff. I think that there was a paper that came out not too long ago where they did that technique where they analyzed the ticks for the blood of the things that they fed on, and it was actually there were a lot more species that they were going after than just, you know, deer and white-footed mice made up the biggest individual food sources. But there were a number of other things, chipmunks and a variety of bird species that they were also feeding on, some other wildlife. And so I think that there could be some localized differences in how they're getting around or which of those species are reservoirs. You know, not every critter out there is a reservoir for these diseases, meaning that not every animal can pick up a disease and pass it on to the next tick that bites it. So imagine that there's got to be a lot of variation caused by that, you know, between my landscape and yours.